Hey guys, tonight we return to the shadows of ancient Rome, where marble temples gleamed under the moonlight, and the sound of nailed sandals echoed like whispers from a distant past. But don't get comfortable just yet, because tonight's story is not a gentle lullaby. This is the journey of Marcus Atilius Regulus, a Roman general whose loyalty to honor led him straight into the hands of the enemy, and to one of the most horrifying executions in history, being slowly lowered into a cauldron of boiling oil. Trust me, if you had been there, you wouldn't have survived long enough to whisper a single prayer. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you listen to the story, I really want to know, where are you watching from? And what time is it where you are right now? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You gently close your eyes, imagining the sound of the wind blowing through the ancient stone walls of Carthage, a bustling trading city where the air was once filled with the fragrance of olive oil jars, pine resin, and spices from the east. But tonight, it is not fragrance, but the scent of fear, of battles waiting outside the city gates. You are hearing the story of Marcus Atilius Regulus, the Roman general whose cruel fate turned him into an immortal symbol. Just imagine this. Rome at that time was like a giant startup that had just successfully taken over the entire Italian peninsula and now was eyeing the international market, specifically Carthage, the commercial giant of the Mediterranean. The two powers clashed, and the result was the First Punic War, which broke out in the year 264 before Christ. This official historical event lasted more than 20 years, draining resources to the point that many cities seemed forced to join a marathon without a finish line. The strange thing that few mention: Rome originally had no maritime tradition. They were good at stationing troops on land, fighting with infantry, but at sea they were as clueless as you on your first day at the gym, not knowing how to lift weights. Yet within just a few years they built a fleet of hundreds of warships. Perhaps you would laugh at the image of Roman soldiers practicing rowing for the first time. Water splashing everywhere, oars cracking noisily, just like a failed team-building session. But that very stubbornness created a miracle. Historians still debate. Did Rome win at sea thanks to tactical creativity, such as their invention of the Corvus Bridge, which allowed soldiers to board enemy ships and turn a naval battle into a land battle, or was it simply luck combined with a refusal to accept defeat? In that context, Regulus appeared. He had already become famous for defeating tribes in southern Italy, earning the admiration of both soldiers and the Senate. By the year 256 before Christ, he was entrusted with commanding a campaign to lead Roman troops all the way to Carthaginian soil. Imagine this. It was no different from a small country today deciding not to play defense anymore, but instead sending its army overseas to besiege its rival right in its capital. A bold, reckless move. When a fleet of more than 300 ships, carrying hundreds of thousands of soldiers, advanced toward the coast of North Africa, the Carthaginians who saw it must have felt the same as we do when opening our wallets and realizing the account is empty after a shopping spree. Complete shock. The official record says the Romans landed successfully, crushed the first Carthaginian detachments, and marched straight toward the city. But what few know, when the Romans poured in, they did not only seize gold, silver, and slaves as spoils of war, but also encountered luxurious products never before seen in Rome, from ivory to rare spices. For many soldiers, it must have felt like their first time stepping into an upscale supermarket after years of eating dry bread. They were dazzled, and because of that, began to neglect discipline. And then, the turning point came. The Carthaginians invited a special guest, Xanthippus, a Spartan mercenary. He looked at how Rome fought and immediately judged. You fight well, but you chose the wrong stage. The flatlands around Carthage were a paradise for cavalry and war elephants, something Carthage had in abundance. Historians still debate. Was Xanthippus truly the tactical genius who helped Carthage turn the tide, or merely a figure created by later generations to explain Rome's sudden defeat? Either way, the Battle of Tunis in the year 255 before Christ was a disaster. Tens of thousands of Roman soldiers were killed or captured, and Regulus, the proud general, fell into enemy hands. You see, from a hero almost touching victory, he became a prisoner. But the story did not stop there. Carthage did not kill Regulus immediately, but kept him as a political card. They let him live in relatively comfortable conditions, treated as an honored guest, because he had bargaining value. Just imagine, it was like keeping a rival CEO to use as leverage at the negotiating table. Then a few years later, Carthage devised a cunning plan. They gave Regulus temporary freedom to return to Rome, carrying their peace terms. As long as he persuaded the Senate to agree, he would live. But Regulus had to swear, a sacred oath, that if he failed, he would return to Carthage. You might think just forget the oath. No one would know. But to the Romans, an oath was more sacred than life itself. Strangely, Regulus truly returned, stood before the Senate, and opposed peace. He called for continuing the war, even though he knew that meant he himself had to return to die. Do you see the paradox? It was like being handed a chance to escape, yet choosing to walk back into the torture chamber. Historians still debate. Did Regulus act this way because he truly believed Rome would win if it persisted, or because he wanted to become an eternal symbol of Roman spirit, even if it meant death? You sigh, because you already know the ending. Regulus returned to Carthage, and there he endured torments that make anyone shudder just to hear them. The Carthaginians, instead of killing quickly, turned his death into a prolonged spectacle, psychological torture, depriving him of sleep, then cutting his eyelids, so his eyes would always remain open under the blazing North African Sunday. If it were you, just hearing that might make your eyes sting. A light joke, like when you accidentally open your phone at 3 a.m. and the screen light burns your eyes. Finally, the most horrifying punishment, being slowly lowered into a cauldron of boiling oil. Not water, but thick olive oil, holding heat, clinging to flesh. Imagine the Carthaginian crowd gathered, cheering, then suddenly falling silent at the sound of sizzling flesh. A moment when even the enemy stood still. What few recount. The bronze cauldron was specially crafted, like an engineering project of the ancient world, designed both to torture and to display Carthage's wealth. Every detail of the execution was arranged like a political play. Historians still debate. Were the cruel descriptions of Regulus's death 100% accurate, or were they embellished by Roman writers to portray Carthage as barbaric and to glorify their own unyielding spirit? Either way, the impact was clear. The story became the fire that drove Rome to fight to the end. You sigh once more, but you also feel the weight of the story. A man who chose to keep his oath, accepting a horrifying death, leaving behind a legacy beyond time. The image of Regulus became a symbol in poetry, in history, and in the hearts of Romans, as proof that there are principles that cannot be sold, not even for life itself. And tonight, as you sit listening in the dark room, perhaps the fan hums softly like a distant drum, you suddenly realize this story is not only about the past. It is a reminder that in a world full of calculations, sometimes the hardest choice is the very thing that defines human nature. You are still sitting quietly, listening to the fan running steadily like the rhythm of ancient drums. The story did not end at the cauldron of oil, because the death of Regulus only opened a new chapter. A chapter that swept Rome, Carthage, and even outsiders into a storm of emotions. News of his death spread as quickly as a rumor on social media today. Just a few merchants docking, a few whispers in taverns, and soon all of Rome knew. People did not only hear that he was executed, but also countless horrifying details were added. Perhaps no one could verify 100%, but in the imagination of the Romans, their indomitable general had died in the most terrible way possible. The official historical record notes, when that news arrived, both the Senate and the Roman people rose in anger. If before, some still hesitated about continuing the war, afterward no one wanted peace anymore. The hatred of Carthage flared up like a flame newly fed with oil. Strangely, few know. The first person to turn private grief into public action was Regulus's wife, Marcia. In the records, she is said to have personally taken part in torturing Carthaginian prisoners captured in Rome. Hard to believe, but she inflicted on them the very torments her husband had endured, from confinement in spiked boxes to being exposed under blazing sunlight. A detail both gruesome and revealing that in the ancient world, war did not only take place on battlefields, but also invaded families, hearts, and personal vengeance. Historians still debate. Did Marcia's actions truly happen, or were they embroidered to heighten the tragedy of Regulus's story? Some argue it was real, since Romans carried the mindset of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth in war. But others believe it was only fiction, a way to make Regulus's image shine brighter. He died for honor, and his wife carried on that flame through revenge. Just imagine, in Rome, people began to write poetry, to build narratives about Regulus as a martyr. He was no longer just a defeated general, but a vivid testament to the virtue of keeping one's word to the very end. Noble children learned his story as an introductory lesson about honor. You surely see, it was no different from the way we now retell anecdotes about those who dared to sacrifice their careers, or even their lives to stay true to their beliefs. The official historical record continues. Rome, despite heavy losses at the Battle of Tunis, did not give up. They rebuilt their fleet, corrected their mistakes, and after many years of attrition, finally won the First Punic War in the year 241 before Christ. Sicily fell into Roman hands while Carthage had to pay a massive indemnity. In modern terms, it was a compensation contract that Carthage signed only to want to weep afterward. What few notice, the story of Regulus spread beyond Rome, reaching Greek cities, Egypt, even distant lands in the east. For many peoples, it became an example of what is called politics through symbols. One man dies, but leaves behind a unifying power greater than an entire army. You see, sometimes a story is more dangerous than a sword. Historians still debate, was the death of Regulus truly worth it? Some scholars argue it was a useless sacrifice, for he could have remained in Rome, helping his country with wisdom rather than his life. But others insist that it was precisely his return to Carthage to face death that made Rome unite and resolve to fight to the end. Without it, Rome might have accepted a half-hearted peace. You smile wearily, because this story feels like a problem without a solution. To live in order to continue serving, or to die in order to become a torch that lights the way. Even today, when you face difficult choices, there will be moments when you ask yourself, should I choose the safe solution? Or should I hold on to my principles until the end? Sometimes, that very question is the deeper lesson that Regulus left behind. And then, you clearly hear the slow rhythm of the story, almost like ASMR. The imagined wind from the North African desert, the distant cheers, and then the heavy silence after the cauldron of oil cooled. In that silence, there are the cries of Regulus's family, the debates of philosophers, and the footsteps of Roman soldiers, determined not to stop until Carthage was subdued. A touch of light sarcasm so you don't feel too heavy. If Regulus lived today, surely he would become the most terrifying disciplinarian in the company once he promised a deadline. He would never be late, even if it meant staying awake all night or jumping into the cauldron of a broken laptop. You probably shudder, imagining that scene in the office. In the end, Regulus became a symbol. Poets like Horace, historians like Livy, placed his name in their writings so that every later generation would remember. There was a Roman who kept his promise, to the point of sacrificing his life. Rome won the war, but that spiritual victory resonated even further than the lands they conquered. You take a deep breath, feeling as if you have just passed through an entire long night with the story. From Rome, from Carthage, from the distant drumbeats, you draw the lesson. Honor, faith, and determination can make a person immortal in human memory. And even though you lie in a modern room, listening to the steady hum of a fan, you are also participating in that tradition, the tradition of retelling stories to keep the fire alive. You hear the fan vibrating softly, like distant drumbeats in the night, and the story of Regulus does not yet close. In truth, his death did not end in the Carthaginian cauldron, but continued to live in imagination, poetry, and philosophy for thousands of years. Perhaps you have noticed this too. Sometimes a person disappears, but their name lives longer than any victory. The official historical record. After Regulus was executed, Rome not only continued to fight, but also used his image as a spiritual asset. The Senate, the speakers, and even the teachers of noble children repeated that story again and again. He became the archetype of virtus, the virtue most valued by Rome: courage, loyalty, and honor. Roman children, instead of hearing fairy tales, heard about Regulus as we now tell stories of princesses. A strange detail rarely mentioned. For many centuries afterward, people even staged tragedies based on the death of Regulus. In the Middle Ages, his name appeared in religious manuscripts as an example of a pagan who nonetheless acted like a saintly martyr. By the Renaissance, Regulus was regarded as a symbolic figure to compare with contemporary leaders, those who had the courage to put national interests above themselves. You see, from a defeated general, he became a timeless moral example. Historians still debate, is the image of Regulus that we know today too beautified? Some scholars argue that his death was truly horrific, but the story was painted and polished by Roman literature to turn it into an epic. While others believe that even if there were embellishments, the core of the story, the choice of honor over life, is true, and that is what gives it resonance. Try placing yourself in the present. You live in a world flooded with compromise. Everything has a price. Every principle can be bargained. Yet Regulus reminds us that survival is not always victory, and accepting defeat is sometimes the only path to immortality. A light joke, if he lived today, perhaps he would be the only promise keeper left on social media, say live stream at 8 o'clock and it really starts at 8, not delayed half an hour like many others. Another official event, Rome later won the First Punic War, and the story of Regulus was often cited as the inspiration that kept them from giving up. That victory paved the way for Rome to become the master of the Mediterranean, opening the era you later know as the Roman Empire. Without Regulus's sacrifice, would Rome have persevered so much? Some historians say yes. Others believe it was precisely that story that pushed Rome beyond its limits. What few know, in later Western culture, Regulus was even mentioned in works of political philosophy. Enlightenment philosophers regarded him as an example of civic duty, placing the community above the individual. Even modern leaders, when wanting to speak of honesty and determination, once referred to Regulus. You might find it a little funny. A general thrown into a cauldron of oil more than 2,000 years ago, becoming an ideal model in today's management classes. Historians still debate, should we regard Regulus as a heroic symbol, or merely as a victim of a system that valued honor to the extreme? One side says, if everyone behaved like him, the world would have more decent people. The other side argues, sometimes being too rigid only brings tragedy to family and self. And you? Do you choose to live in compromise or die proudly? Not an easy answer, just like choosing between watching your favorite episode or going to bed early for work tomorrow. Again, you hear the narration like a whisper. In the night, Regulus is still present. Not with a body consumed by fire, but with the question he left behind. How important is honor in life? When should we keep our promises? And when do we have the right to let go? Those questions, from ancient Carthage, now echo all the way to your bedroom tonight. A touch of light sarcasm to keep you awake. If someone once promised to repay the money they borrowed but keeps forgetting, try sending them the story of Regulus. Who knows, they might feel guilty and transfer the money immediately. In the end, you realize the story of Regulus is not only about a horrific death, it is a reminder that choices made in life and death moments truly reveal the essence of a person. Regulus chose to keep his word, chose honor, and because of that, he entered into immortality. You close your eyes, feeling as if you are drifting between two worlds. Rome with the sound of marching drums, Carthage with blazing fire, and your own room, where the fan still whirs like steady breathing. The story ends, but the echoes remain, like whispers from the past. Sometimes, the death of one person can mean the life of a civilization. You shift slightly, the fan in your room still humming steadily like a distant heartbeat. And after hearing the story of Regulus, the death in a cauldron of boiling oil in Carthage, you surely ask yourself, were the Romans and Carthaginians the only ones to invent such cruel punishments? In truth, if you move forward a few more centuries, stepping into medieval Europe, you will see that human imagination in torturing fellow beings was far more abundant. The official historical record, in the Middle Ages, law was often tied closely to religion. Those considered heretics, rebels, or traitors were often subjected to public punishment, both to penalize and to educate the crowd. Executions became public events, drawing large crowds as if attending a fair. A strange detail few know. Some torture devices were crafted so intricately that they almost resembled furniture. The iron chair covered with spikes looked no different from an ordinary wooden chair if viewed from afar. Prisoners were tied to sit on it, and even the slightest movement was enough for the spikes to pierce their flesh. Horrifying to hear, yet the crowd treated it as entertainment. You might relate humorously. It is no different from buying a cheap office chair, sitting too long and getting back pain, of course. Here the pain was 100 times worse. Historians still debate. Were torture devices like the Iron Maiden, a coffin of iron lined with spikes, truly used widely? Or were they the product of 18th century collectors who wanted to exaggerate the image of a dark Middle Ages? Some evidence suggests that many of these things may only have been exaggerations, so later generations would look back at the Middle Ages as barbaric. You sigh, because whether true or embellished, they reflect humanity's obsession with fear and power. The Middle Ages had a series of punishments that made people shudder. The breaking wheel. Criminals were bound to a large wheel, and their bones were crushed with iron hammers. The crowd cheered, while the punished only wished for a quick death. Public beheading. It sounded quicker, but was still staged like a festival. In England, even children were sometimes brought to watch in order to learn a moral lesson. End of tying to the stake and burning alive, especially reserved for those accused of heresy. Smoke billowed thickly, and priests often recited prayers right beside them. The scavenger's daughter, a device that compressed the body until the prisoner nearly broke their own bones. Just hearing the description is enough to make you want to sit up straighter. And there were many other bizarre punishments, such as forcing someone to wear a red-hot iron helmet, or making them drink water until their stomach swelled unbearably. Compared to ancient Rome, perhaps the only difference in the creativity of the Middle Ages was this. It was labelled, "In the name of God." Aye? A touch of sarcasm to make it easier to breathe. It sounds terrifying, but just imagine if social media had existed back then. Surely there would have been people live-streaming executions with the hashtag number medieval justice. Historians still debate. Did public punishments really deter crime, or did they only create a culture accustomed to violence? Some argue it maintained social order, while others say it sowed the seeds of later uprisings, because once the people were used to seeing blood, it became easier for them to rise up. And you realize, whether it was Rome, Carthage, or medieval Europe, these stories all share one message. Power always seeks to manifest itself through fear. But what truly shapes human memory is not fear itself, but how people confront it. You adjust your posture slightly, letting the sound of the fan blend with the narration, and we continue to slip deeper into an even darker world, medieval Europe. If the death of Regulus showed you the combination of honor and brutality, then medieval punishments opened up a living museum of fear, where power was displayed publicly before the eyes of the crowd. Just imagine. A morning in a 14th century English square, instead of coffee and newspapers, people went out to watch an execution. The crowd gathered early, street vendors bustled, children laughed and played, and right in the center stood the scaffold, the wheel, or the stake. It was both justice and entertainment. The breaking wheel, the crusher, the official historical record. One of the most infamous punishments was the breaking wheel. Criminals were bound hand and foot to the large spokes of a wooden wheel. Then the executioner struck each joint with a hammer or iron bar. The condemned usually died slowly from blood loss, shock, or simply exhaustion. What few people know, the victim was not always killed immediately. In some cases, they were bound to the wheel and hoisted up like a living sculpture, left to the sun, rain, and birds picking at their remains. A kind of public warning that made anyone passing by shudder. Historians still debate. Was this punishment truly effective in deterring crime? Or was it merely a tool to display the ruthless power of rulers? Some records show that instead of fear, many people saw it only as an occasion for a crowded gathering. Beheading. Swift but full of ritual. You might think beheading was the most humane, but in the Middle Ages it was not so simple. The executioner sometimes missed the mark, needing several blows to finish. The crowd both cheered and jeered if the scene looked too clumsy. A strange detail. Many nobles considered beheading a privilege. For them, hanging or burning was disgraceful, but beheading by axe or sword was worthy of their rank. Put humorously, it was like the premium package of death. Historians still debate, did public beheadings truly make people more obedient? Or did they instead turn executions into performances that sowed the seeds of further violence? Burning at the stake, the fire of faith and fear. Those accused of heresy, witchcraft, or treason were often bound to wooden stakes and burned alive before hundreds of people. The rising flames were not only punishment, but also a ritual of purification, at least according to the religious belief of the time. What few mention, before the burning, victims were often bound with iron rings around the neck or waist, so that if they struggled too much, they still could not escape. And in some humane cases, the executioner would strangle the victim before the fire touched them. But humane, here, as you see, was merely cruelty sugar-coated. Historians still debate. Was the number of women burned for witchcraft really as high as later accounts claim? Some modern studies suggest the figure was exaggerated, meant to emphasize the Middle Ages as a dark age. The scavenger's daughter, the deadly embrace. If the Iron Maiden, the iron coffin lined with spikes, was haunting, then the scavenger's daughter was even more terrifying. This was a triangular iron frame that forced the prisoner to fold up, head pressed to knees, arms and legs locked tight. Within minutes, blood rushed to the head, joints ached, and if prolonged, the victim could die from compressed organs. A strange fact: this device was invented under the reign of Henry VIII. Yes, the king famous for having 6 wives. It was used alongside the rack, one stretched, the other compressed, as if the torture menu offered a full range of choices. Historians still debate, was the scavenger's daughter widely used, or only a psychological weapon to intimidate prisoners? The number of records of actual use is not many, but its image remains haunting even today. Public humiliations, both punishment and entertainment. Beyond executions, the Middle Ages had countless forms of public shaming. Minor offenders, like chicken thieves or liars, could be locked in cages hung in markets, forced to wear fool's caps, or tied to posts for the crowd to throw rotten eggs and tomatoes at. Sound familiar? That's right, it was no different from today's social media, where a small mistake can turn you into public laughter. What few know, sometimes this punishment was harsher than lashes, because the shame of being ridiculed by the community could follow someone for life. And in some places, offenders were even tattooed or branded so that anyone who saw them would know their crime. Historians still debate, did these shaming practices truly help maintain village order, or did they merely create a culture that delighted in witnessing the pain of others? You lean back a little more and realize, from Regulus in the Roman cauldron of oil, to the bone-crushing wheel of the Middle Ages, to the witch-burning flames, all reflect one thing. Humanity has used fear to bind each other within circles of control. But what remains with us is not the terror, but the question, why do people keep repeating these methods, from antiquity to the Middle Ages, and even, sometimes, to this very day? A touch of sarcasm to lighten the mood. If you lived in the Middle Ages and missed a tax deadline, you probably wouldn't just get a financial penalty. Most likely, you would be forced to wear a giant fool's cap and parade around the market for everyone to laugh at. Say what you will, but a fine is still easier to endure, isn't it? You gently close your eyes, letting the hum of the fan blend into the narration, and the story continues to unfold. From the smoky punishments of the Middle Ages, we step into the Renaissance and the early modern period. This was a time when Europe blossomed with art, science, and philosophy, but at the same time, the stakes, wheels, and torture machines had not disappeared. In fact, they were refined to be even more professional, as if humanity wanted to mix the light of civilization with the darkness of cruelty. Punishment in the Renaissance, when politics and religion became one. The official historical record. In the 16th century, when the Reformation erupted, Europe was divided into Catholic and Protestant. Those suspected of following heresy could be brought before the Inquisition. And once caught in the Inquisition, few escaped. People could be burned alive, chained in dark dungeons, or simply vanish. What few people know. In Spain, the Spanish Inquisition even had rooms designed more to frighten than to torture. Prisoners were led through corridors filled with eerie drawings, bells, and echoing footsteps. Some confessed to everything before a single finger touched them, simply from psychological pressure. It sounds like a modern escape game room, but of course here, you had no option to quit the game. Although historians still debate. Did the Inquisition truly kill as many people as later tales suggest? Or was it an exaggerated image constructed by political forces opposing Spain? Cutting hands, cutting ears, the shortened version of death sentences. As society entered the early modern period, many punishments shifted from killing immediately to setting an example. Theft, counterfeiting, or betrayal could be punished by cutting off a hand or an ear. A strange fact. In some places, the side was specifically designated. For example, the right hand symbolized labor, so if one stole, that hand would be cut off. And cutting the ear ensured that everyone could see it, like a living identity card, announcing to all, this is someone who once committed a crime. Historians still debate, did these bodily punishments really reduce crime, or did they only push those with cut hands and ears to the brink, with no way to live except to continue committing crimes? Hanging, from justice to public stage. The official record. In England, from the 17th to the 18th century, hanging became the most common method of execution. It was quick, cheap, and especially could be staged right in the town square. People gathered in crowds as if going to a festival. In some trials, thousands pressed together, selling liquor, selling cakes like a macabre fair. What few know. Sometimes the sentence was lightened right on the gallows. If someone was pardoned at the last moment, the crowd cheered, even carried them off to celebrate. But on the other hand, if the rope was too short, the condemned did not die instantly but writhed for minutes. Some called it a deadly pantomime, where the audience laughed while the victim suffocated. Historians still debate. Did public executions make people more obedient, or did they in fact nurture a culture of cruelty? Many records show that crime still increased, despite the noisy executions. Water torture, sophistication in pain. In the early modern period, people began to devise methods that sounded less bloody, but were no less horrifying. For example, forcing continuous drinking of water until the stomach swelled nearly to bursting, or dripping water drop by drop on the forehead, driving the prisoner mad from psychological pressure. A strange fact, in some places they even used semi-scientific methods, such as claiming that water torture could wash the soul of a heretic. Doesn't it sound like modern detox advertising? Except instead of drinking green juice, here it was being forced to death. Historians still debate, were these methods applied widely, or only in certain special cases? Many records came from political rivals who enjoyed exaggerating the cruelty of the other side. Renaissance, but still soaked in blood, the paradox of civilization. You think of the Renaissance, Michelangelo painting church ceilings, Leonardo da Vinci inventing flying machines, people singing praises of intellectual freedom. But at the same time, right in the square, a woman could be burned alive for suspicion of witchcraft. Civilization and cruelty coexisted, like two sides of a coin. A touch of light sarcasm to ease your breath. If Da Vinci had lived in the time of the Inquisition and tried to invent a robot, perhaps he too would have been accused of witchcraft, and his invention burned along with him. And you realize across the centuries, from Regulus in the Roman cauldron of oil, to the crushing wheel of the Middle Ages, to the gallows of the early modern period, all reveal a terrifying truth. Humanity has always sought to turn death into a public stage. We do not only kill to eliminate enemies, but also to tell a story, to sow fear, to strengthen power. But at the same time, those very tragedies gave birth to symbols. Regulus became a Roman legend, martyrs became saints. And even within pain, history recorded lessons of honor, justice, and a brutality that never fully disappeared. China. When law became a performance of power, the official historical record. In many Chinese dynasties, especially the Ming and the Qing, there was a punishment so infamous that hearing its name alone was enough to chill the spine, lingqi, or the death by 1,000 cuts. The criminal was tied, and then, cut after cut, their flesh was sliced away, slowly, over the course of hours. What few know. This punishment was not only to kill, but also to destroy the soul according to contemporary belief. Ancient Chinese thought that the body had to remain whole to cross into the afterlife. Being cut into 1,000 pieces meant losing both this life and the next. That fear was even more horrifying than the physical pain. Historians still debate how many cases were truly executed by Lingqi, or was it more of a political symbol for deterrence? Some records suggest the numbers were often exaggerated to highlight the severity of the dynasty. Japan, the sword and honor. The official record: in feudal Japan, samurai who committed crimes or great failures could be subjected to seppuku, ritual disembowelment, to preserve honor. This was not a punishment imposed from outside, but a chosen, peaceful way to avoid disgrace. A strange fact: seppuku was often performed in a solemn ritual with witnesses, farewell poems, and even a friend or retainer standing by to deliver the final beheading immediately after the belly was cut, to lessen the pain. Both brutal and beautiful, if such a word can be used. Historians still debate: was seppuku truly the honor that the Japanese praised, or merely social pressure forcing individuals to sacrifice themselves for the image of the collective? The Arab world. When religion and justice intertwined. The official record: in many Islamic dynasties of the Middle Ages, heavy crimes such as robbery, rebellion, or adultery could be punished by cutting off hands, stoning to death, or hanging bodies in the desert. These punishments were often carried out publicly, in markets or squares. What few mention, in some places, punishment was seen as a chance for redemption. After being punished, the criminal could be regarded as having repaid their debt to the community and to Allah. In other words, justice was wrapped in a layer of religious meaning, turning pain into purification. Historians still debate: how many stoning executions were truly carried out? Or were they laws on paper, rarely applied? Some Islamic regions practiced them, while others only cited them without frequent enforcement. The Aztecs sacrificed to maintain cosmic balance. The official record: in pre-Columbian America, especially the Aztec Empire, human sacrifice to the gods was part of social life. People believed that the sun needed blood in order to rise each day. Prisoners of war were often brought to the top of temples, hearts cut out and offered to the gods, then bodies rolled down the stone steps. What few know: it was not only human hearts that were offered, but sometimes blood was collected in golden cups to be poured over statues of gods. This was not merely killing, but a cosmic ritual. If it was not done, the whole world could fall into chaos. Historians still debate: did the Aztecs truly kill tens of thousands in a single ceremony, as some Spanish records claimed, or was that number exaggerated to justify the conquest and destruction of this civilization? You finish listening, and surely you shudder. Each civilization had its own way of turning death into a message. For Rome, it was honor. For China, it was the fear of a broken soul. For Japan, it was the sword of honor. For the Arab world, it was redemption. And for the Aztecs, it was maintaining the entire universe. A touch of light sarcasm so you don't feel too tense. If we lived in Aztec times, perhaps every time the sun rose, everyone would sigh in relief. Oh, thank goodness it's still light today. You hear the fan still humming steadily, like a distant background melody, and we continue to drift into other civilizations, where punishment was not only about retribution, but also reflected belief, culture, and the frightening creativity of humankind. Ancient India, karma and punishment. The official historical record: in the Manu law code, around the 2nd century before Christ, the 2nd century after Christ, punishments were clearly divided by caste. Those of lower classes who erred faced beatings, imprisonment, or even execution, while those of higher classes might only be fined or socially restricted. What few know: there were punishments involving war elephants. Prisoners were forced to kneel, and trained elephants would either fling them into the air with their trunks or crush them underfoot. In some cases, if the king wished to be merciful, the elephant would crush the head quickly, but if he wanted to deter others, the elephant would slowly crush the body part by part. Both terrifying and symbolic, since elephants were considered sacred animals. Historians still debate: was the punishment of death by elephant truly common, or was it exaggerated by foreign writers to emphasize the strangeness of India? Ancient Greece. when justice was tied to philosophy. The official record. You surely remember the death of Socrates. He was not executed by the sword or the gallows, but forced to drink the poisoned hemlock. This was the method of execution for citizens, considered more elegant since it shed no blood. What few mention. Some records say that before drinking, Socrates even joked with his friends, saying, "This is only a journey a little further." His death became a philosophical lesson about spiritual freedom, not merely a sentence. Historians still debate, was Socrates truly condemned to death for corrupting the youth, or because he was too outspoken, daring to satirize the Athenian government? The Vikings, cold-blooded among the ice. The official historical record, in Norse sagas, there was a notorious punishment called the blood eagle. The condemned had their backs slashed, ribs broken outward, and lungs pulled out like wings. This was a punishment for traitors or great enemies, a strange fact. Many modern scholars believe the blood eagle may have only been a metaphor in Viking poetry, not something truly practiced. But if it was real, it would certainly have been one of the most barbaric punishments ever conceived. Historians still debate, did the blood eagle truly exist? Or was it only a poetic myth misunderstood literally by later generations? Ancient Egypt. When the tomb was more important than life, the official record. In Egypt, tomb robbers were considered guilty of heinous crimes. Punishments could be amputation, burning alive, or being condemned to forced labor. What few know. Some accounts tell that, as a deterrent, robbers were smeared with resin wrapped in cloth and turned into living mummies displayed to the public. A terrifying irony, because what they sought, mummies, became their own fate. Historians still debate. Was the story of living mummies real, or merely legend, retold by Greek and Roman historians to make Egypt seem more dramatic? The Maya, game and death. The official record. The Maya had a famous ball game, where two teams had to strike a rubber ball through a stone hoop using hips and thighs. But this was not only a game. Sometimes, the losing team was sacrificed to the gods. A strange fact. In some places it was said the opposite, that the winners were sacrificed, since it was considered an honor to give one's life to the gods. Win or lose, you wouldn't want to be on the field. Historians still debate, which is true. Was it the winners or the losers who died? Archaeological evidence remains inconclusive, leaving the story shrouded in mystery. You see, whether in China, Japan, the Arab world, the Aztecs, India, Greece, the Vikings, or Egypt, each civilization found its own language of fear. Some treated death as purification, some made it a cosmic ritual, and some turned it into a philosophical lesson, a touch of sarcasm to ease your breath. If you lived in these civilizations, you would probably want to behave better than usual, because the menu of punishments already sounds painful enough. You lean back slightly, letting the fan sound like wind sweeping through the corridors of history. We leave behind the temples of the Aztecs, the flames of the Middle Ages, and step into another era, the early modern to modern age. This was the time when Europe and the world began to speak of reason, liberty, equality, but the guillotines, secret torture chambers, and labor camps still stood, towering as reminders that civilization is never separate from darkness. The guillotine, symbol of the French Revolution. The official historical record, the guillotine, the modern beheading machine, appeared at the end of the 18th century. It was designed to kill more quickly and humanely than execution by axe or sword. The French Revolution turned it into the symbol of revolutionary justice. Anyone who opposed, whether King Louis XVI or Queen Marie Antoinette, had to step onto the scaffold. What few know, the guillotine was considered fair, because it killed everyone the same way. Before that, nobles were beheaded, commoners were hanged or tortured. With the guillotine, all were equal in death. It sounded democratic, but surely you wouldn't want to try this kind of equality. Historians still debate, was the guillotine truly humane? Some records claim that after the head fell, the victim remained conscious for a few seconds, even blinking or trying to speak. A question both horrifying and haunting. Tsarist Russia, prison wagons, and Siberian labor camps. The official record. From the 18th to the 19th century, the Russian Empire used the katorga system, penal labor camps in Siberia. Thousands of political prisoners and criminals were shackled and forced to march thousands of kilometers in bone-chilling cold to cut timber, mine, or simply live and die in the snow. What few know, there were prison wagons, cramped wooden carriages carrying dozens of people in dark, freezing, airless conditions. For many prisoners, that was already a death sentence before reaching Siberia. Historians still debate, was katorga merely a political tool to crush uprisings or also an economic strategy, exploiting free labor to develop Siberia? England and America, from public to civilized executions. The official record. In the 19th century, many countries began to see public executions as vulgar. In England, the last public hanging took place in the year 1868. In America, hanging continued, but gradually moved inside prisons. What few know, America experimented with more humane methods, including the electric chair, introduced in the year 1890. At first, people believed it would be quick. In reality, many executions failed horribly. The current was too weak, the condemned convulsed in smoke, and the smell of burning flesh. A scientific advance turned nightmare. Historians still debate, were the electric chair or lethal injections truly less painful, or just ways for modern society to hide the truth that death is never gentle? Modern Japan and China, between tradition and reform. The official record. In Japan during the Meiji era, when the nation westernized, many brutal traditional punishments were abolished, replaced with hanging. China as well. The Qing dynasty finally abolished lynching in the year 1905, regarding it as barbaric in an era of international integration. What few know. In Japan, there were still public hangings in the early 20th century, drawing thousands of spectators, like remnants of the Middle Ages. Historians still debate, did the end of brutal punishments truly come from humanitarianism, or simply because Asian countries were forced to change to avoid being despised by the West? A glimpse of modernity, justice or concealment. Today, the world still practices executions, lethal injection, hanging, firing squad, but instead of in public squares, they are hidden behind thick walls. Justice has become more civilized on paper, but the core question has not changed. Is it necessary to turn death into a tool of deterrence? A touch of sarcasm to make you smile. If Regulus came back to life and saw the guillotine or the electric chair, surely he would say, "Oh, at least you've advanced beyond Carthage, it seems faster." You see, from Rome, Carthage, the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, to the early modern era, and even modern times, punishments changed. But the meaning remained the same: to use fear to control, and sometimes to turn the dead into symbols. You close your eyes, breathing lightly to the rhythm of the fan, and we turn to another branch of the story: the psychology of the crowd when witnessing executions. Because from the time of Regulus in the cauldron of oil to the guillotine in the Paris square, the common point was not only the pain of the victim, but also the thousands of eyes fixed on them, cheering, weeping, or shuddering in silence. The crowd, spectators of violence. The official historical record. In ancient Rome, executions or gladiator games always had audiences. People came not only to see criminals die, but also to feel safer, to believe that justice had been done. What few know. Sometimes, executions came with food and drink for sale, just like a fair. Some accounts tell that, at certain medieval trials, children were lifted onto their fathers' shoulders to see the hanging more clearly. The crowd was not just a witness, they were part of the social ritual. Unquote. Historians still debate. Did executions truly deter crime, or did they simply satisfy the blood-soaked entertainment needs of the crowd? Some records show that crime even increased around execution sites, because the gathered crowds created opportunities for pickpocketing and trade. The feeling of relief when seeing others suffer. Just imagine, when an entire community witnessed a criminal being punished, everyone felt that order was restored. It was a psychological effect. Seeing evil punished, people believed society was more just. But sometimes that feeling turned into dangerous pleasure, joy at another's suffering. a touch of sarcasm to ease the tension. It sounds exactly like when you see someone you dislike online being stoned by the internet community. You think justice has won, but in truth, it is also a form of public digital execution. End. The crowd and the spread of fear. The official record. During witch burnings in Europe, the crowd came not only to cheer but also to remind each other, if you stray from the faith, this will be your fate. Public punishment was a tool of collective control. What few know, sometimes the crowd itself was haunted. Many went home after witnessing and had nightmares, recounting the screams and the smell of burning flesh. Some accounts even say spectators fainted on the spot. Historians still debate. Did the crowd truly believe in the justice of witch burning, or did they attend only out of fear of being accused themselves if absent? Some modern studies suggest many people went simply because they were afraid of suspicion if they stayed away. From the square to the screen, the legacy of habit. Today, you no longer see executions in the street, but that psychology still exists. You watch horror movies, violent games, sensational news about murders, all tap into the same instinct: curiosity about pain and death. A strange fact. On social media, when there is a public victim, a celebrity exposed, a scammer revealed, the crowd immediately gathers, commenting, sharing. Just like the old squares, except now, you join in from your phone screen. Historians and sociologists still debate, is cancel culture and online stoning the modern continuation of public executions? Some say yes, it is the same psychological mechanism. Others argue that at least now there is no blood, only honor and careers destroyed. But the psychological consequences for the victim remain devastating. Moments of silence. When the crowd is haunted, whether cheering or mocking, there are moments when the crowd also falls silent. When Regulus touched the cauldron of oil, when the guillotine fell on the French queen's neck, when flames swallowed a woman in Salem, spectators froze, realizing they were witnessing something beyond endurance. It is in those very moments that collective memory was carved deeply, a touch of sarcasm to ease the pace. Today, those moments of silence usually come when the internet lags or a live stream freezes. The whole crowd sits waiting, perfectly quiet, then erupts again when the image returns. Isn't that the same spirit of the medieval audience? The crowd, victims and accomplices, you realize something strange. The crowd was both victim and accomplice. They were controlled by power through fear, but they also helped sustain the cycle of violence by participating. Without spectators, public executions lost their strength. But without executions, the crowd felt empty, missing their entertainment. Historians still debate. Can humanity ever fully abandon the allure of violence? Or do we simply change the way we package it, from the square to the screen, from hangings to action films, from burning at the stake to cancelling online? You sigh, but also smile bitterly, because listening to these stories is not only to know how cruel people once were, but also to reflect on ourselves. In this modern society full of LED lights, internet and soft sofas, we still gather in the digital square to watch others being stoned. And in the sound of the fan you ask yourself, have we truly stepped out of the Middle Ages, or have we only changed the stage from stone and wood to pixels and Wi-Fi? You take a deep breath, letting the story slowly settle. After so many centuries, from Regulus in the cauldron of boiling oil in Carthage, to the crushing wheel in medieval Europe, from the guillotine in the Paris square, to the electric chair and modern lethal injection, we see a strange circle. Punishments changed, but the essence remained. It was always a tool to send a message. Whoever dares to defy power, whoever dares to break the law, must pay with their very life. A strange thing, little expected. Those deaths often did not make people forget, but instead turned the victims into symbols. Regulus became a Roman legend. The witches burned alive became reminders of fanaticism, and the guillotine became an indelible mark of liberty, equality, fraternity. As if, even though power wanted to sow fear, history chose to preserve the rays of light from those tragedies. Historians still debate, does justice have to be tied to violence? Some say that it was precisely that publicity and brutality which kept society in order. But others argue, cruelty only creates another spiral of hatred, and people must learn to build justice on dignity rather than fear. And now, as you sit in the dark room, listening to the story like a lullaby, you understand that public executions are only memories. But the lesson still remains. True justice is not in the blade or the flame, but in human choice. The choice to turn violence into a tool or compassion into a legacy. You exhale, smiling faintly. The night has deepened, the light has dimmed. The story closes, like a reminder that history is a mirror. In this moment, you are the one who decides what to remember: fear, or the lesson of courage and humanity.